Everyone's agreeable. So our story this week is welcome everybody. Great to have everybody together again. Hope everybody had a wonderful Pesach. And here we are marching towards Har Sinai together. And as is our custom, we start with a story. I had revisited a Hasidic story that I found appropriate for today's topic. And the story is about a lumberjack who was in Ukraine, and he had a son who, when he became marriageable age, he brought various appropriate young women to meet him. And the story goes that every time he would meet a young woman, as a prospective partner, he fainted. And this went on after shidduch, and the parents, of course, were quite concerned, and they went to the Baal Shem Tov. First they went to doctors. They tried to see if there was a remedy, a physical remedy. No one had neither a diagnosis nor a remedy, and he eventually went to the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov heard the story, and he listened, and he said, when he finds the right girl, he won't faint. That's part one. Story continues that the same lumberjack, he had a good business, and the business worked this way that he would cut down the trees, he'd put them in the river, and downriver they would pick up the trees. Someone, his partner or whatever, his associate would actually.
But I'm not coming.
Somebody's not on mute. Maybe you should put everyone on mute. Thank you. Anyhow, the story continues that one winter or one summer, I don't remember which, they had a very big, how do you say that? There were many trees that he was able to cut down, and he put them in the river. But the story was that time there was this major storm, and the logs became diverted, and instead of going to his regular partner to take them in and to sell them, they ended up all over the place. He couldn't track them. They were literally off of the river, and he lost his entire crop. What do you call that? That particular sales. I'm losing my English. Anyhow, he couldn't track where the merchandise was, so the merchandise was gone for that year. And that's how he made his living. He had to get them sold in order to even support his family. So the story goes that he was literally broke at that point. He had no way to recover what had gotten lost, and he had no way of continuing to support his family. So again, he went to the Baal Shem Tov, told him the story. And the Baal Shem Tov looks at him for a minute and says, I think you have to go and beg. You have to become a beggar. And he'd always been self-supporting, and he had a good business. And he looked at the Baal Shem Tov. He said he couldn't believe his ears. He said, I've never had to beg in my life. I can't imagine. There's nothing else for me to do. And the Baal Shem Tov, he said, he didn't answer. He just shook his head. And this fellow was devastated, but he took upon himself to be able to support his family. He had to go town to town, as is sometimes common in those days. And he'd show up at the town and he'd beg. And the story continues that he found himself in some town, and he was just, again, whenever he had some time, he would go to the study hall, the Beit Midrash, and study Torah. And one of these towns, after doing his rounds, he went into the Beit Midrash, and he's learning Torah. And one of the townspeople that he actually had visited earlier came up to him and said, I see that you're seriously learning. He had noticed that he didn't look like the average beggar when he first met him, and he said to him, tell me, how much do you make a day in your begging? He said, a ruble and a half. He said, tell you what, I have a big business that I don't spend enough time learning Torah and at home. If you come to my house and you learn Torah in my living room, while I'm busy with the business, I'll give you 2.5 rubles for each day that you learn. And whenever you want to go back to your family, you can do that. And they made a deal. So he came to this, we'll call this new fellow, the businessman Yosef, we'll call the lumberjack Chaim. So Chaim comes to Yosef's home, and he's learning Torah there, getting his 2.5 rubles a day. And one evening, he hears Yosef, the Balabait, the man of the house, and his wife, they're having some discussion, and he hears that the wife is crying. And he had already developed a bit of a relationship with them. So the next day he went to them, he said, probably none of my business, but I heard you crying, you've been so good to me. Is there any way that I can help you and your wife? And they looked at each other and they discussed. Anyways, they came back and said, look, here's our situation. I'm sure you can't do anything, but since you become kind of part of our lives, we'll share it with you. Our daughter is a beautiful young lady, and she's marriageable age, but she has this strange situation where every time she meets a man who is an eligible potential partner to be married to, she faints whenever she meets him. And our Chaim smiles to himself and he says, I can relate. That's something that I can understand. That must be very difficult. And he said, I'm planning to go see the Baal Shem Tov, the famous holy Baal Shem Tov, the rabbi. At some point, maybe tomorrow we'll go. You can come with me and you'll put this problem in front of the Baal Shem Tov. Maybe he has something to say to you. So sure enough, they set out. It takes them 2 weeks to get there. And they come to the Baal Shem Tov's home and he welcomes them. And he says to him, the Baal Shem Tov, we'd like to share with you this situation. He comes with his daughter, right? Chaim and his daughter come with Yosef, Yosef and his daughter come with Chaim. And the Baal Shem Tov says, yes, I'm happy to sit with you, but before we do that, just he tells Chaim, go get your wife and your son to come, and they'll sit in the room next to my office, and I just like you to bring them here right now. He says, okay. He doesn't know why, but he brings them, and they're sitting in the office next to where the Baal Shem Tov is hearing now the story of Yosef and his daughter, and they explain to him the whole story with the fainting. And he says, what should we do? He asks now Yosef, by the way, do you have a proper dowry for this girl? What can we do to get her married off? He asks them, what's your finances? At that time, it was a considerable important component of making a shidduch. And Yosef answers, actually, I make a very decent living. I have actually a booming business now. Since you ask, not so long ago, I had this situation where these logs showed up on my doorstep, and I ended up selling them, like this huge shipment. We tried to figure out who it belonged to, but there was no way of knowing. I spoke to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, yeah, you could, it's yours, it's halachically yours. And he went and sold, and with that money, he bought a business, and he had been very successful in this new business. He said, now I have a very wonderful dowry to provide for a young man, for the couple. So the Baal Shem Tov says, "Oh, that's wonderful to hear." And then he says to Chaim, "Would you mind bringing in your son and your wife now?" And the son and the wife walk in, and the young boy and the young girl look at each other and don't faint. They both don't faint. And the Baal Shem Tov says to the families, "Mazel tov." He said, look what Hashem had to do. He had to take away your parnasa from this log, from you being a lumber, had to send it over to Yosef so that you would discover him and bring these two couples together. Mazel tov. Anyways, that's the story. And these Baal Shem Tov stories, of course, have many layers to them, but it's a beautiful story that relates to our topic, as I hope we'll come to. I just want to review for all of us, and just for those who are new, we have several sections of our discussion. First, we open with a story, hopefully that has some interest and some relevance to the topic of the day, that particular diber, the commandment. And then we do a meditation, which we're going to do in a minute. And the meditation is, of course, of the Aseret Workshop, the so-called 10 Commandments, followed by the first paragraph of the Shema Yisrael, of the Shema, what we've been referring to as the Pledge of Allegiance of the Jewish people, those two elements opposite each other, which appear in Sefer Dvarim and Deuteronomy, 15 psukim apart from each other. I think I may have mentioned last time, someone pointed out to me, they actually appear side by side in an actual Sefer Torah. When you open up a Sefer Torah, you can see the Aseret Workshop opposite the Shema Yisrael, the way it's written in the actual text of the Sefer Torah. We do that meditation, and then we introduce the diber for the day, which I then explain the actual text briefly. We then go into what we call the mitzvot ikariyot, or the mitzvot ikarit, the central mitzvah of that diber, We use the term diber, which is the Hebrew word for what's translated commandment, but it's really a statement. So we translate the diber and we go into the central mitzvah of that diber. And then we discuss as a group what core values do we see inside of this particular diber. Because once we understand that they're principles, not just individual commandments, so I'm asking all of you to consider and respond to what elements, what are the key principles and their derivatives that you can see in that particular diber. From there, we go to a discussion of how to find this diber within us, right? And that is based on the Mechilta that says that the Aseret Dibrot were imprinted on our souls at Mount Sinai. So this is not just something external, it's actually something that's a source of Jewish identity for 3,300 years. And therefore our exercise and our work is to expose that, to reveal it as an actual inner expression of our soul identity, our spiritual DNA, if you will. And we do that by looking inside, and we do that in our breakout groups where I pose questions both on the so-called negative side and so-called positive side. In other words, how we feel and experience the transgression of that diber, and how we feel and experience the fulfillment of that diber. As we've pointed out, each diber has within it both positive and negative elements, meaning that there's something to not stealing, and there's something to giving that which is yours to others. So each one has a positive and negative expression, and we explore that internally, and we share it in a group. Afterwards, we collect as much as we can. I'm going to do that a little differently this time. We try to get a sense of what the whole group insights might be from that sharing. And after that, we discuss some final elements of bringing it together and seeing the different elements of the core values, and some source material that hopefully helps us see it as one that helps create a certain synergy between those elements that are contained in the diber, but actually contribute to one main diber, one main principle that can contain many elements, but that allows us to actually feel it in an integrated way from within. Of course, not negating the fact that everyone has their own personal dimension that they can experience within that diber, because it's both imprinted on us as a people, but as individuals as well. So we take it into account everyone, what the Torah calls shivim panim l'Torah. There's 70 facets to every aspect of Torah. So of course, there's going to be multiple dimensions that people see from their own individual experience and their own individual character and perspectives. And that's what we're trying to gain also from the group experience. At the end, I ask everybody to, in some ways, write up a takeaway that they've gotten from this particular session, which is helpful for me also to know what you're getting and what not. And I try to leave everyone with a little bit of what we call an avodah, a focus for the week, where they can actually work with that particular core value of that diber in an expressive way throughout the week, to keep it into your consciousness as we move forward towards Shavuot. We're now 6 weeks from Shavuot, the receiving of the Aseret Dibrot, the 10 Commandments on the holiday of Shavuot. So we got 6 weeks to gear up and to prepare and to what's called tikkun amidot. We prepare our character and prepare our consciousness to be able to receive the experience of 10 Commandments, the experience of Mount Sinai in as deep a way as possible 6 weeks from now. And lastly, we leave 15 minutes optional for questions and answers for those who want to stick around. Okay, I actually found it helpful to my son Yoni, who is not here today, but he was with us a number of times. He mentioned to me that he felt that the consistency of the organization of the class was very helpful to him, and he felt to others that we sort of have a certain rhythm to how we go through each diber together. So I felt I would review that as a group. Okay, here we go. We're going to now move into the meditation state. So I ask everyone to, Rav Nitzan's going to bring up the text, and I'm going to say it in English again. Some people felt the Hebrew might be better. I'm going to, for the benefit of those that don't know the Hebrew, What happened to it? We lost it for a second, the Rav Nitzan. Try to bring it back. And I'm going to ask everybody to get into a comfortable position and allow themselves to just let go. Allow yourself to feel fully in the present. All distracting thoughts put aside. We're going to meditate on the central pledge of allegiance of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, that which was given to us at Har Sinai. And the experience of Mount Sinai, as we've mentioned a number of times, still resonates throughout the world. This experience of direct revelation of God's voice at Mount Sinai was given to us to be able to continue to walk in his presence, to feel his presence, to experience his guidance in our life, both individually and as a nation. And the whole world, according to the Midrash, heard something that emanated from Mount Sinai. And we're going to reconnect with that energy now. And not only from the standpoint of what we heard, but the Shema, which is in a basic sense our response to those Aseret Dibrot. As it says the words, Vahayu hadvarim ha'ela, those, it should be that these dvarim, these statements should be on our hearts. We should teach them to our children. So we're going to review that, but from a different state of consciousness. I ask everyone to take a deep breath, relax, open your minds and your hearts, and create a passageway for your soul to re-experience Mount Sinai at this moment. I am Hashem, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the place of slavery. Do not have any other gods before me. Do not carry the name of Hashem, your God, your Lord, in vain. Remember the Shabbat day to sanctify it. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely. Do not covet. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear Israel, Hashem our God, Hashem is one. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meyodecha. You shall love Hashem your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. V'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha. And these statements which I command you today shall be on your heart. V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam, v'shivtecha b'veitecha, u'v'lechtecha v'derech, u'v'shochbecha, u'v'kumecha. And you shall teach them to your children, and speak of them when you sit at your home, when you travel on your way, when you lie down, and when you get up. Ukshartam liot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot beinenecha. And bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be tefillin between your eyes. Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha. And write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Today's is lo tinaf, do not commit adultery. Thank you, Rav Nitzan. Okay, you can take the screen away now. Thank you. Okay, as you remember, we're going in reverse order. What in Hebrew is called Sfira La'achor, a countdown. Even though technically we count up when we count the Sfirat HaOmer. For those that are familiar, there's the days from Pesach into Shavuot. There's a special mitzvah in the Torah to count those days. And the word is usafartem. You should count them. It's the same word in Hebrew as what we call the emanations of creation, the sfirot. And counting from Pesach to Shavuot is a time of tikkun midot, the time where we actually purify our midot. We live in a world where we need to lift our consciousness, and both our consciousness and our behavior and our emotional reality to be aligned with, ultimately, with the Aseret Workshop. The 10 Sfirot correspond to the 10 commandments, these 10 emanations. We're not going to go into detail about that. Perhaps at the end of the course we will. But for the moment, we're just going to note that this is a time where we actually have a correspondence of those Divrot and Sfirot, of the commandments and these emanations. And we'll look at that at one point. But it's a time where we actually desperately want to be coming to Mount Sinai with an openness of mind and heart, with a readiness to receive. So this particular diber is something that speaks to that in many, many ways, and we'll try to open up now. So the diber says literally lo tinaf, which is translated loosely, don't commit adultery. In fact, the word ni'uf in Hebrew, as the Ibn Ezra points out, and the Sforno, it actually has a broader connotation than the literal word adultery. In Hebrew, it's called eshet ish. But that is the, as we've called it before, the mitzvah ikarit, the central commandment in this diber is adultery, what Hebrews called eshet ish. And without going into the many details that one could discuss about that, because it's not our interest to go into the halachic ramifications of all this, it basically refers to adulterous relationships and the prohibition of having, in particular, a relationship with a married woman. And this dimension of sexual prohibition, as we mentioned earlier, is clearly a pinpointing a particular central dimension of all the Torah's sexual prohibitions, which includes incest and includes having intimate sexual relations outside of marriage, all the various types of sexual prohibitions that we find in the Torah. And so we're dealing with something that has a general category called how one's to conduct their sexual relations. Of course, the ideal being to have heterosexual relations in marriage. And this is something that is obviously a sensitive topic generally, and certainly in our times in particular. We're talking about how to talk about that ideal. What do we do with all the different issues? I have to make sure, I'm not very, I may not be even skilled enough to deal with this politically correctly, but it's a question of, certainly I carry the sensitivity that whoever's listening to this and whoever will be listening to this should know that I'm not coming with any personal judgments on anyone. We're discussing what the Torah speaks about as an ideal. The Torah also recognizes many different tendencies that people will have and choices that people will make regarding their sexual preferences and their personal compliance or lack of compliance with what the Torah sets out. I'll just mention this in passing. It's sort of a bit off topic, but I'll mention it in this part of the discussion. My teacher, Rabbi Weinberg, when he was asked about whether the Torah is all or nothing, right? Sometimes people view Judaism and Torah in particular as a kind of an all or nothing system. And, either you keep the Torah or you don't. Either you keep Shabbat or you don't. And his view was that that's a very superficial understanding of the Torah, because the Torah itself is composed of many dimensions. And the example that he would use, interestingly enough, is within the so-called 613 commandments of the Torah, the Taryag Mitzvot. There are 3 prohibitions that deal with homosexuality. One is a general prohibition, not to commit homosexual relations. Another is a specific one related to your father, don't have homosexual relations with your father. Another is not to have homosexual relations with your father's brother, your uncle. And he would ask the question, who are the last 2 speaking to? If there's already a general prohibition against homosexual relations, why does the Torah have to have a special one of the Taryag Mitzvot saying, don't have it with your father, don't have it with your uncle? And he's saying it's clearly somebody who is having homosexual relations. Okay, but not with your father, not with your brother, not with your uncle. There's something about this particular example that paints a picture that the Torah is not speaking to an all or nothing reality of human beings. It acknowledges that there are many levels of alignment and levels of non-alignment with the variety of prohibitions and the variety of mitzvot that the Torah provides. I'll just tell another little anecdote here. When I first came to Toronto, I was asked by a synagogue to speak at their adult education program. And I agreed, and the head of the organizer, he said to me, what's your topic? I said, I'm new in Toronto. I'm happy to speak on whatever you'd like. I feel pretty confident that whatever you're going to choose, you choose the topic and let me know, and I'll speak on the topic. A few weeks later, I found myself at a meet I think it was a Sheva Brachot, and I was, there was a Rosh Hashiva at this event who called me over. He said, "Can I have a word with you?" I had never met him before. He said, "Is you Shalom Schwartz?" Yes, Shalom Schwartz. He said, "Are you the one speaking at this synagogue in a couple of weeks?" Yeah, I'd kind of forgotten about it. He said, "Yeah." He said, I don't think the topic you picked is actually very appropriate. I said, "Oh, really? I didn't even pick the topic. What was the title of the topic? What was it given?" He said, "You're speaking on the topic of Jews and sex." He didn't think that that was the wisest choice for my entry into the community as some sort of an Orthodox rabbi. Anyways, it was a funny little anecdote. I ended up speaking on it. It went fine, but it didn't win me points with the yeshivish community to be speaking on that topic. The point is, anytime you speak about sex, it's a bit of a sensitive point. Anytime you speak about sex, certainly today, you need to know that everybody's coming from their own place and everybody has their sensibilities. So I'm saying that in advance. We're going to touch on these topics of marriage and sexual preferences, not preferences, but sexual prohibitions. And this is not coming from a place of judgment of anyone. It's just coming from an interest in understanding what we can glean from the Torah's approach to these subjects. Okay, having said all that, I have somewhere to go now. Okay, so as I mentioned, the basic overview is that there is this specific prohibition against adultery that seems to be at the core of this. And then you have this other category called sexual guidance, sexual prohibition, sexual mitzvot related to sex. Okay, and they're wide ranging. There's all sorts of prohibitions ranging from having sex with an animal to all the incestual relations that the Torah prohibits, to intermarriage is included in this area. There are all sorts of things that the Torah allows and doesn't allow with respect to our sexual life, our intimate life. So the flip side of this, of course, the positive, is that the Torah has much to say about what's called in Hebrew kiddushin and nisuin, the mitzvah of marriage, the mitzvah of sanctifying the relationship of sex in the context of a committed relationship of marriage. And this balance is what we're going to probe today. That on the one hand, there is this, the Torah speaks very severely against infidelity, against sexual disconnection, in the sense of it being not just a physical act, but something that takes place in the context of a committed marriage relationship. And at the same time, it speaks about the beauty and the elevated place of the bedroom in Jewish teachings. Kabbalah, of course, speaks about this in many powerful ways, that this is the place in which you can feel God's presence in your home, in your life. The bedroom can be the holiest place in the home. Shira Shirim, the famous King Solomon's love song, which is a description of two lovers, is described as the Holy of Holies, because it describes, it's a metaphor for our relationship with God, but it's describing a very beautiful and powerful, intimate love relationship between man and woman. So for those of you familiar with that, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail now, but I think that's the basic category of what we're talking about. We're looking at these as core values. There's a core value of how we relate to the relationship of marriage, how we relate to infidelity in marriage, and also how we relate to all sorts of sexual purity and sexual impurity, if you will, things that can take us away from our elevating and making holy that sexual relationship, and those things that can actually diminish it. So that's where we are. So I wanted to open the discussion now to the question of what core values do you see in this diber? Okay, what are the possible, what comes to you as something that is a core value? Remember, core value we're speaking about is something that guides you in a whole range of areas of life, right? There's something that goes beyond the literal specifics because it includes many specifics. So what comes to you as a core value that you would see in this particular, the seventh commandment, the seventh diber? Yes, Arlene, you can put you're on mute. You want to take off your mute?
Valuing your body.
Beautiful. Okay, there's something about how you look at the value of the human body, the value of the sexuality of the human body, and a broad category of looking at your body as a whole. Okay, great. Next, anybody else want to share something about that?
Loyalty.
Aviva, loyalty.
Loyalty. Very
Beautiful.
fundamental.
Right. Clearly, loyalty is at the heart of fidelity or infidelity. And where loyalty, what role does loyalty play in that relationship? And how do we build a sense of loyalty generally in our relationships? And how does that play itself out in everything we do, in our relationship to ourselves? Beautiful, loyalty. Anyone else?
I was going to say emotional vulnerability, something that comes to mind.
Okay, great. So
along with the
emotional
physicality,
vulnerability.
there's an emotional dimension to that physical relationship that has to be very much honored and nurtured.
Okay, beautiful. So the closer our relationships, the most we expose ourselves. Obviously, in a sexual relationship, there's a tremendous amount of exposure and vulnerability, how we carry ourselves in those situations, how we're sensitive to the other in that situation. Beautiful. Okay, great. That's helpful. Anyone else? Lev.
I would say that this idea brings to mind this notion of, like, maybe it's a Kabbalistic concept, but it just seems really like, I guess you could relate it to anything, that you, in order to be able to give something, the person has to be in a position to receive it. If it's Torah wisdom, if it's love, if it's a gift, whatever it is that you're trying to give, the person on the other receiving end has to be in a position to receive it. And it's not like you can just scream whatever that is that you want and then, so I'm not leaving all the details out, but it doesn't seem like too far of a leap from do not commit adultery to understanding where the other is, so that if you're trying to share something, the person is able, it's not just about you giving it, it's also about the person. It's actually about the intersection of the two, not just about one person or the other person. And it's something that kind of echoes through the rest of life. That's just not about like a sexual thing, but it's also about just being and giving and sharing with people in a way that is a little bit different than just spouting off stuff.
Okay, beautiful. It's something very beautifully Kabbalistic about what you're saying. And, there's multiple dimensions to that, but I think you've got onto something. Thank you for sharing that.
I was wondering, Sorry, I was wondering whether it's not really direct response to your question about the core, but I was wondering whether in this diber it's meant to mirror God's relationship with Israel as his spouse, and whether that's a valid analogy here.
And not only a valid one, a very central one. So, we haven't gone into that so much, but certainly if it's a question you're asking, if you know that the two luchot, the two tablets are seen as parallel tablets. And of course, number 7 corresponds to number 2, which is all about maintaining an exclusive relationship with God, not replacing him with other gods. So that certainly is not only legitimate, but very central to understanding the depth of this particular diber, is that it reflects that relationship.
In which case God understands man's straying.
Nice. Okay.
God understands man's what? Man's train?
Straying from the path.
Straying.
Yeah.
Straying.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Yes, Arlene.
I would think it would have a lot to do with procreation. That, you have to have a heterosexual relationship to have children and to have an intact family. Really helps.
Beautiful. Certainly, this would be a place to look for the Torah's emphasis on building a family and all the implications of that, and how central family is to the Jewish people, and our history and our commitment. And certainly you can find it there. Very nice. Thanks. Okay, I think we got a lot to work with there. So just in a quick overview, we're looking at multiple dimensions here, from loyalty to family to giving and taking, and the dynamic of that, and the whole issue of relationship with God that's mirrored in this, and our relationship to our physical bodies, and to the extent to which, when sex occurs outside of the context of a loving, committed relationship, how that represents a certain separation of the physical and the spiritual, but the unifying of the two perhaps is also a value here that I'm hearing. In any case, we can go on and on. I'm going to just stop it at this point, just sort of reflect on what we've heard. I think it's clear that this is a very broad and important subject. Given that our interest in particular is to discover this from within, so I'm going to now create a bit of a sensitive assignment that for the breakout groups. I want to emphasize that no one is encouraged even to share personal details about circumstances that might help with this memory, but I'm asking people to actually reflect and recall, and then share, if you choose to, a time where you felt someone was disloyal to you, or you were disloyal to someone else, where you experienced the impact of this diber in your life, in whatever way that comes to you. Again, it could be by being the victim of some, God forbid, sexual abuse or some infidelity, or being the perpetrator of such a thing. Both sides of it give us insight and access to an inner experience of the significance of this diber. In whatever way the diber speaks to you, it could be in the context of a loyalty, it could be the context of your physicality, it could be the context of a sexual relationship. The purpose of the sharing is to talk about how you felt when that occurred. What is your inner experience of that gives you insight into its significance? By recalling it, we can appreciate the depth of integrity, loss, whatever comes to you, the depth of significance, the desire to change, not to do it, whatever, or even the enjoyment that you had, and it filled you with a sense of whatever. But by lifting into that experience of it being your own personal experience of it, you can hopefully tap into some understanding of what it means to you, this particular diber. The flip side, which is the second exercise, people should think about both of them and then share them in the groups, is to think of the positive side. Okay, when did you feel that you met your beshert, as we say? When the moment when you felt you found your other half, or you experienced avoiding an affair and you felt the strengthening of your integrity, or by protecting the relationship, you managed to feel the sense of commitment and connection to that loyalty that gave you an inner sense of strength and pleasure in fulfilling this dimension of a diber in its positive aspect, in its positive way. Okay, so those are the two exercises, a little bit challenging. And again, I encourage people not to feel that they have to share, and certainly not to share details, because it's not appropriate for this context to go into what actually happened. Use your judgment. But the groups that we'll divide into, again, it's groups of about 3, right, Rav Nitzan? Everybody should take a short sharing, and we'll have 10 minutes, 5 minutes for each of the exercises to share. And I'd like this time to have one person volunteer to sort of take notes of insights that they can then come back to the bigger group and share in writing. Okay, so at the beginning of your session, one person take responsibility to kind of take notes, and that way everyone can have some benefit from all the group's insights. Okay, any questions? Okay, we're going to go into groups now for 10 minutes, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Your whole fan club. I went to pick up a bagel this morning, and I'm driving out, and I look over and someone's having a yard sale of tools. So I called Dan Hogg. And I said, Dan, I'm pardoning you for coming to Cooper School today. Go get your tools. You're going to be much happier. And the fact that I thought he was going to go there and come here right afterwards.
Right.
So he must be having a field
day.
in the
Yes.
field.
Yes.
In the field. Yeah.
How's he doing?
He's okay. Rachel's got so much to figure out.
Yeah,
She described it this morning as the biggest shock of her life.
and it's interesting.
Dan,
Dan,
Guys, I can hear you. Can you? I don't know why my video is not on. Can you see me?
No.
Try start my video again, but it doesn't want to do it.
rigorously exercises. And
it's
it's
interesting.
Can you hear me?
we hear you.
Okay.
Can
Lev,
you
we
turn
can
the
hear you.
recording off, Rabbi?
Oh, yeah, let me.
Do this.
I can't get to chat.
It should be on the bottom of your screen.
The third icon.
Okay, I see it.
Disloyalty, anger affects our relationships with the perpetrator. Okay. To feel how it changes the dynamic. Loyal allows people to feel well and excel. Okay, great. It also impacts the people around you. Right. We think that sometimes these infidelities are just affecting the couple, not to mention the children and the other people. It affects so much more than just the couple itself in so many cases. And loyalty breeds confidence. Beautiful. Confidence within ourselves and with others. Okay, here we got some more. Feels shocking, disturbing, is destructive to many relationships. Helpful to have good role models, good relationships, enhance our lives. Kids want their parents together, protects women. Certainly important. The relationships to me are like Venn diagrams. When one circle overcomes and absorbs the other, there's a sense of violation. When the circles are too separate, there is a sense of distance and disconnection. When there's a happy intersection, both individuals maintain identity and both have needs met. Okay, I think you can write a book on that, Lev. That's a lot in that. Okay, due to time considerations, I'll just take that for what it is. I hope that the exercises were helpful. I'm going to bring things together a little bit with the word brit. We know that the Aseret Divorce themselves are called a covenant. When you look at your materials from the Chai Mitzvah materials, you'll see there's a whole discussion. Rav Soloveitchik has a very beautiful essay about what Lev referred to earlier about the covenantal relationship between the Jewish people and God, and the covenants that we make in marriage. And a covenant is a very unique relationship. We don't have covenants all the time. Covenants are not just contracts. They're something that creates a whole bond. My teacher Rav Noach used to talk marriage it's a holy bond. It's something that creates a new reality. That's not to say that every marriage works and not every marriage fulfills that. And of course, it's worth mentioning that there is a mitzvah in the Torah called divorce, right? We don't believe in marriage, and there's something called the Mitzvah of Divorce, which means when it's an appropriate time to have a divorce, there's a way to do it that disconnects that holy bond, and it needs to be done in an appropriate way. But it's acknowledged that not every marriage works, and there's such a thing as divorce. But the ideal in marriage is a covenantal connection, which means it's two parts of the whole. And as the Talmud speaks about our sense of completion that we seek in marriage, as someone once put it, before you're married, you're half a person, and after you're married, you're finished. But it's something that when we look at this concept of holiness with an H and holiness with a WH, right? The wholeness that we seek in an ideal, in a relationship where we become one with someone, the covenant is about that dynamic that says we're in this together. We break out of our I and we go into a consciousness of we. And that we consciousness, of course, is of the essence of the entirety of Torah. So it's loyalty in the sense of commitment to fulfill our covenant, and we commit to that and we do our best to it, but it's much more than just the decision to follow through on that. It's a recognition that something new has been created in a marriage that binds us together, that creates a bond that is actually a shlemut, a completion of self, right? That we complete ourselves by going beyond ourselves, that somehow getting out of the ego state, we can connect with another dimension of being, which happens in this thing called marriage. And we know in Kabbalah, of course, this is something does reflect the attempt to bring together these disparate parts of male and female that are in all of creation, and that by bringing them together in a covenantal destiny, we recognize that that is of the essence of what life has to offer. It's oneness, and therefore this tiber brings us into touch with our relationships, all of our relationships, and that when we do seek to have oneness with another person, we learn about the nature of completion and of self in an expanded sense, of the sense of we. We run out of time. We could go on and on about this, but I'll just leave everybody with one little assignment that we can take into the week, which is to be aware of this we consciousness. Be aware of your own sense of loyalty and how you fulfill it. And of course, on the most basic level, it's a fulfillment to ourselves. If we're loyal to others, we're loyal to ourselves. If we have integrity in our relationships, we feel our own personal integrity. And ultimately, it brings us into the potential of having Hashem's presence in our relationships. And marriage is, in the most ideal scenario, it's very difficult. Anyone who's lived a little bit knows that. And in Judaism, we say you can't really beat the Yetzer Hara. It's called the Yetzer Hara, the desire for infidelity, the desire to go look outside. All of these things are natural expressions of being a human being. But they say if you try to beat it just on your own, forget it. The Talmud says, we're all at mercy to these desires unless we recognize that we can access a higher spiritual relationship that gives us this capacity to live in a state of oneness and wholeness with ourselves and with God. It's my own experience this particular Pesach in trying to seek a greater freedom. I went back to my old patterns of, okay, I'm going to beat this addiction. Okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Went on for 3-4 days of Pesach. And every time I did that, I find myself more entrapped by it. And then I realized, what am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing? I think I can actually do this on my own. And that's the Torah's teaching. We don't do this on our own. We do it through seeking Hashem's presence in our life, through surrendering to His will, to recognizing that when we become a channel for God's will, then we can actually be free. We can free ourselves from our addictions, to our desires, our addictions to our bad habits, our addictions to our not living with our highest vision of self. So with that in mind, I encourage you to watch, to bring God into this state of your marriages, into your relationships, whatever relationships you're in. Bring Hashem's presence into those relationships and see how they can actually take on a whole new dimension. Anyways, you can pick whatever exercise you do, but this is the focus for this week: loyalty, commitment, bringing God's presence into relationships. With that, we'll end today's session. If you want to list some at the chat, a takeaway that you got from this, please do. And we'll just end at this point. See you next week. Those who'd like to stay for 15 minutes of questions or so, I'm here. Questions and comments are invited. Yeah. Was that a question, Moshe, or is it a goodbye? Okay. All right.
In progress.
I had some questions and comments, but I kept losing the connection and I forgot.
So the question we were discussing here has to do with the attitude of the Divrot and the Torah generally to the difference between men and women, in the sense that I was making the case to Heidi that I thought this debate in particular is directed more towards men than women in the Torah worldview. The view of men is different than the view of women. And Heidi was disagreeing with that, or
Well, but again, back in the day,
yeah,
when polygamy was acceptable, it was sleeping with a married woman is more of an issue than sleeping with a single woman. But my question was more, what about but then what about the reverse? A married woman sleeping with a married man, or a single woman sleeping with a married man, and how is that interpreted?
Well, it sometimes can be interesting to look at the varying degrees of severity that the Torah holds for different types of choices that we make, and it is a subject of, people do get into that discussion. I in this particular case, I mean, it's important to first say all of the above are discouraged, to say the least, right? So which ones carry exactly which penalties and severities, it's a matter of some halachic discussion, and the Talmud does deal with those questions. Let's say this. I think that one of the things that Rav Kook speaks about, which I find interesting in this regard, is that the evolution of, and the Rav Ilan in our book on the Ten Commandments quotes this passage, which I found very interesting. People tend to view history as repeating itself, and then we have the same issues that keep on coming up and going away and coming back, and right. Rav Kook takes the view that everything in history is actually heading towards, is moving forward. It's all part of a progressive. He has a very progressive view of history. I don't know if that's the right term, but even those things that seem to be back steps, he looks at them as forward steps. I mean, the classic example from his teachings is, kafira. The explosion of epicursis, denial of God, or different forms of rejection of Torah and mitzvos in his day, with the explosion of what's called the Enlightenment and the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And he says it's a mistake to see this only as an aberration, but actually this is the unfolding of God's will, meaning that the meeting an epicurus, a serious denier of God, on a simple level, it forces the believer to clarify what actually is his belief, and it forces a believing community to go deeper and to understand why it is that people are leaving. It's easy to blame the people that are leaving. Oh, they don't understand. They're too superficial. They're low. But he says that the first step is to say, well, is our living with our relationship with Emunah, of our living relationship with God, what could we learn from this situation and go deeper? That's the simple level. But he says further, he says they left it because it was superficial for them. Now, you find commentaries on the Rasha, for example, in the four sons of the Haggadah. The Ishbitzer Rebbe says that the Rasha is the deepest of all of the four children. How do we see that? Because he wasn't satisfied with the level of avodah that he was seeing. He goes like he needed more depth, and it wasn't being explained to him. He wasn't showing. He said, well, gotta give me more. And if he didn't get it, he was challenging the status quo. So what am I saying in this context? I'm saying that the Rav Kook took a generally speaking, a positive view of modern developments, even those that seem to contradict Torah observance. And he saw the emergence of secular Israelis as teaching something and playing a significant role in the emergence of God's presence in the world. I mean, the obvious example was the building of the kibbutzim, and secular Israel he saw as an essential rebirth of the physical dimension of the Jewish people. So their emphasis on that was necessary, because we came back and now we're not just a soul in the diaspora, we're a soul in a body. What am I saying in this context? So Rav Ilan in his book makes the case that all of the changing norms around marriage can be seen in this light. And the emergence of the status of women and the strength of women, or the emergence of free choice of women in the context of choosing marriage partners, and all of that goes into our modern societal developments, he said, can be seen in the light of, it was one thing when people got married because they had to. It was the social norms. It was, okay, people don't get married as easily today. It's a tragedy. It's terrible. They're not going to have kids. Yes, there is that side. But the other take on it is that marriage now, when you look at it from the standpoint of two people choosing, not just expectations of the society or even religious expectations as the basis for marriage, but choice, both for the man and the woman, being the foundation of a deeper relationship and a chosen relationship to make a marriage work. You can see the unfolding of history and ultimately the revelation of God in history in a different way. I don't know if that was helpful at all, or even addressed your question, but
Thank you.
okay. Anybody else?
There are 11 spheres, not 10, in the standard image of Sirot.
Yeah, that's for the advanced Kabbalah class that we might have as a follow-up to this, with meditation and Sfirot and the Divrot. The classic answer to that is, yes, it's 10. Yes, it's 11.
Yeah.
You have a problem with that?
Thank you for clarifying.
Did anybody hear what I was saying? I got cut off. Am I still here? I don't know.
You say?
Didn't hear you,
Can you
Lev.
Go ahead, Lev.
Okay, so what I was saying before I get cut off, I've been losing the signal, is that this idea of bringing Hashem into our relationships, to bring him into our marriage, to bring him into the world, has been too abstract. But when I heard this guy, Rabbi Shais Taub, speaking about this concept, that it's not my wife, this is God, God has given me this. Like, I'm not, if I, I have to, it's not like it's my wife or my child. These are God's people. And I'm talking to somebody that's God. It's like, if I start to realize that it's not really my job, this is something that God has just given me this opportunity to be able to work on myself through these people that he has brought into here. You're you're God's teacher, that you're here. I'm not talking to you, my teacher. You're not mine. It's God's. God's put it here. So when I start to reflect that I'm talking to my wife, but I'm also talking to God, this is what God has brought forth, so that it's not so much my wife, it's an angel, somebody that God has given me to, that I'm able to try to bring God into the picture a little easier.
Okay.
That was great.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that.
That was really nice to hear. That was beautiful.
Sounded like God speaking to me. Okay, on that note, anybody else want to ask one final question? Got time for another question or two?
I'm not asking a final question, but I'm just passing
Or
on
comment.
Janice's apologies for not being able to be with us today.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I think we're done for today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here.
Much.
Well done.
We'll see you next week.
Yasher koach.
Yeah, sure.